I think this page, I think says it pretty well.
134, right?
No, I'm looking at 128.
Okay.
And footnote 69, Conrad-Martius admits that it is a good question whether in the factual given nature there is mechanical causality as it appears to us in our everydayness on the one hand, and as classical physics considered it on the other. It seems unlikely in the light of quantum physics and relativity theory. But if there is mechanical causality, and then there's a parenthetical there, it would have to have the characteristics sketched here, and these structures bring to light those of intellectual causality. Well, I think what Jim is doing in the footnote, roughly is stating what Bill said early on based on his reading, namely that there's not much point in going into a detailed analysis on the current status of thinking by physicists about what the status of ether is, because almost entirely they've given it up, and they gave it up in 1905 because it was of no calculational advantage. And I read a pretty authoritative source on that point this morning that I'd be happy to share if anybody cares. But that doesn't mean that this metaphysical sense of it precedes or is the best grounding from which to view all of the physical progress. Now, how that works out, I don't know, because it's going to take very good philosophers to work that out. And that's not me. So, but anyway, I'm satisfied. I'm happy to withdraw on the question of putting Conrad-Martius to test on whether or not her use of ether is an anachronism, which is where I was starting. And I'm prepared to withdraw on that.
Well, I wonder on that page 128, whether it wouldn't be worthwhile reading that paragraph in the middle of the page where they talk about mechanical, relativity, essential, or down.
Okay.
Well, in that paragraph, she's talking about, this is from the section causality and potency. And in particular, it's a way of talking about these categories of energy and power in terms of her ooseology or her ontology of substance. And causal thinking is something that she's critiquing, as she had been in the preceding sections, by bringing in this category of entelecheia. And it's really from the use of entelechy in the biological sciences, especially like Hans Driesch, for instance, around that time, that she's bringing the category of potency to bear on her philosophy of substance, not just living substance from biology, but physical substance. And in particular, the more all-inclusive notion of substance that the Greek concept is deriving from. So causal thinking here is something that, it is like characteristic of the natural attitude. That's how we think, like, billiard balls is like how we think the world is working naturally. But when we get really scientific about it, then we have to admit quantum physics into the paradigm, and that goes away. Relativity, these are very weird ways of looking at the world, just like looking through the microscope and the telescope for the first time gave us a very different idea of the world, the realm of the invisible, but the real physical universe. And her point is that the real physical universe isn't just physical in its efficacy and in all of its functioning and all of its power, but is rather transphysical in all of its physical transformations. So while the concept of something purely physical, might appear to us, there's a transphysical background, something that's more wide-reaching, something naive and obvious and apparent to us, like a physical ball or a Poland Spring water bottle, as the phenomenologist is often pointing out, is here before us, but it has this like infinite side, and not only does it have an infinite side, but it has an infinite span. It's got like this angelic or etheric wingspan, that you don't see. And different perspectives that we put on when we invent quantum theory, we put on our quantum spectacles or the microscope, or the telescope, and observe heavenly phenomena for the first time. And we have those spectacles on, the scientist wants to put those spectacles together and have like a unified theory, but there's already a kind of unified physics happening in the ancient philosophy that is still left to interpretation. We don't have like a really nice, robust synthesis of metaphysics and the state of science that we have today. That's what we would want. That would be like the ultimate grand unified theory. And Conrad-Martius is getting close to that, or maybe even has some of the important initials of a system, just by like reviving the ancient categories, which is really cool. So there's like aspects of this happening in the idea of entelechy all throughout, but in the like biological sciences, in order to account for not just like physical causal mechanisms like the growth of an embryo. Last time we were looking at section 4.1, and she gets more into this in 4.2 and 4.3 in embryology and these biological sciences, which were in a fairly early state at the time, right? They had to do with like splitting the cell and seeing like if they cut it one way or another way, whether it would continue to replicate. And so that there was like these different lenses that people would put on: holism, epigenesis, etc. And this idea of entelechy was something that Conrad-Martius is picking up, which of course is coming from Aristotle and from this broad tradition in metaphysics that is sometimes called the analogia entis, or the analysis into act and potency. And according to this perspective, the Poland Spring water bottle, the thing of the finished cosmos, as Conrad-Martius calls it, this end product, this end finished product, is not a complete actualization, say, of pure being like we have in Parmenides. It's not just like this homogeneous sphere that doesn't do anything but like maybe rotate infinitely fast or equally not rotate at all, the unmoved mover, have these weird properties. But neither is it the opposite, which in some senses is kind of similarly paradoxical, contradictory, of like the prote-hule, which on Conrad-Martius's account, at one point she calls it transcendental concrete. So there's some interesting ways of describing what these transphysical and ultimately non-physical categories are and how they interact. But what we have in the center, whether it's Mensch, like in the center of her anthropological diagram, or the Poland Spring water bottle, it's not a perfect actualization such that you have the actus purus, this category of the analogia entis, and neither do you have the pure first matter, the primary matter, or primordial principle of materiality, which is also this this ultimately real materiality, so she calls it transcendental concrete. We don't have either of those. Those are like outside of the physical frame entirely, far out, right? But it's from their interacting, maybe in this kind of fourfold way, that you get your Poland Spring water bottle, or your experience of the human being, fully embodied and with culture and everything. So that's the finished universe. So she calls it the finished universe. And then there's like all this other stuff, and there's room in that for all these other characters like angels and demons. And that's more something in the Metaphysical Sprache, but these bigger, broader categories in which such things might have some kind of being, some form of being, includes this like etheric side of the world, like an underworld kind of realm of hyletic stickiness, the unliberated matter, which these spirits are like striving to come into existence, striving to become embodied from. So anyway, there's like all these really, really interesting categories which we entertain when we read the stuff, and we have to like accept it as a heuristic, as a thought experiment, at least, and if we accept all these categories as a thought experiment and see that they have coherence, then it works ideologically as a principle for us to understand things. And then it can enter, theory formation and interaction with other sciences. Now, this was already happening because some of the stuff that she's articulating, like in Driesch and in others, these things are already in the area of the German critical realist tradition, the kritischer Realismus, that goes all the way back to Kant. Kant too has this category of ether. It's in one of these lectures on metaphysics or natural science. If I glance, he's got all these chapters on his critique of the ether, his idea of the ether. The stuff is in the air, of course, but it's with this guy shortly after Kant, Herbart, who is really giving the realist critical philosophy of Kant, the realist version of this. And then there's this whole tradition from him of all these people who represent kritischer Realismus, but especially around Conrad-Martius's time, Bernhard Bavinck and Alois Wenzel are some big proponents of this kritischer Realismus. They actually talk about the topic as well. But then in their worldviews about theory of science, and Wenzel is a physicist. He's actually like working with Einstein and people like that, physicists. Jordan Pascal is another one that's real important for them. I don't know like the details about like whether they are fully adopting this interpretation of Heisenberg that Conrad-Martius has, but for her, she's interpreting Heisenberg's category of where these particles are coming from, this domain of potentiality, potens, called unendliche Unendlichkeit, as the apyric spacetime. So I think that we should maybe work our way towards that section and go through the ether concept a bit, and we'll probably return to it as well. And similarly, we could do well to return at some point in this sort of discussion to sections 3.6, hyletic substance, 3.7, pneumatic substance. But I mean, there's other stuff too, like 3.5, the modes of nature, and for the apyric space-time, the section 3.4, passing time. But those things and these topics that we're getting into with the ether and the apyric space-time, these really lead us into chapter 5. So I'm happy to talk about this stuff today. I just think that before we get fully into these things, I think it's good to get our feet wet with the space-time theory that's being thrown around here. We also have to do well on these pre-chapter 5 topics of like how these things connect to, like in 3.3, it's called the ontological dynamic. There's this fundamental ontological dynamism, you know, that gives this principle of substantiality its omnipresence as well as its singularity as a sort of principle of where this is all coming from, behind physis and beyond physis as this what propels everything, the engine of it all.
Pardon me, Randy. I wonder if I've been looking with interest, but not a lot of comprehension at András's chat citations. I wonder if we could, if András, if you'd be willing to say a bit more about what we're to gain from these sites that you've given us.
All right. I was just picking up Randy's mention of the Indo-European roots to the English concepts of physics, or the Greek words of physis and force. And apparently they are close in Indo-European, but not identical. There is a plethora of stems beginning with BH, aspirated media, explosive consonant. So maybe the relation between the stem for physis with the relation to the stem for force and phainein, by the way, also the stem to phenomenology, maybe is not closer than the relation of any one of these to a third or some fourth stem, for there are many. And I just wanted to give everybody a link to that marvelous database where the late Jewish Indo-Europeanist Pokorny, where his grand dictionary of the Indo-European roots is accessible. I think there is an English version also. You can browse through the stem list and see the affiliations of all those etymologically related word families and word groups. That's a big help if you really want to dig as deep as you can get into the history of the meanings of words. Okay. And then there is also just a gloss to what Randy mentioned also, causality in the context of quantum physics. There is a marvelous experiment, I don't know if everybody is aware of it, already having been proposed by Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, the German physicist who lived until the 1980s, already proposed in 1931, but technically achievable only in the late 1990s, finally realized by a group of, I think, American researchers in physics, where you get a hint of direct retrocausality. It is only a Wikipedia article by which I can give you a first step as to dig deeper into that matter. You will see that it is no matter. It is something which posits nous or intelligibility at the very first place. It's to maybe, how shall I say? It is described quite well, although the critique of the conclusions is maybe exaggerated. There is a certain tendency amongst some people to re-establish Newtonianism, but that is one single very powerful argument for retrocausality, which breaks physical causality, but puts at the very source of reality or realizing things being realized, our consciousness. I don't know whether that is the exact same term in English. We would say Bewusstsein in German, consciousness. So for only some 20 years, we got one iron iron strong, how do you say, foundation for arguing that causality is outdated. It has its territory, but ontologically, finally, in the sense of Husserl's Letztbegründung, it is not tenable.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Andreas.
I hope that what I'm about to suggest is helpful. Later on, and I was searching for where it is, and I got Andreas, you would be the perfect one to address this. Jim refers to HCM's use of the word Untiefe, and he has a footnote. She says, well, of course, this goes right to HCM's views on immortality. And I thought, whoa, where'd that come from? And so I didn't know how to translate Untiefe. And so the translations I got were shoal or shallows. And yet just the opposite was given as a single example, where it seemed to mean the deep. And so I was kind of out to lunch, you know, like how should I read Untiefe, and how strong is the view that Jim's, well, of course, this is related to HCM's views on immortality. He just lost me. He loses me a lot, but he certainly lost me there. And
yeah, maybe I'm losing you too, Gordon. Thank you so much for your trust, but I'm not aware of the context.
Okay, I'll find it.
I'll say something briefly on the prefix an in German. An is inherited from Proto-Indo-European and lies at the base of English no, not, English Latin ne, and so on. But already in the most ancient varieties, there is also something like the English nay, which I believe says something like yes, isn't it? Nay is something like aye, sir, no? Nay, we got that in German dialects too. So there is a certain ambiguity to abstract concepts, and in the guise of the prefix un, as you have it in English also, in German, indeed, there is at least a double reading of this prefix. Regularly, it is just used in order to put something in the negative, now mainly with nouns and adjectives, but in Middle High German also with verbs. We did not yet have not German nicht in the Middle High German. We just put the un prefix to the verb. Now, this is the thing which you are familiar with. There is another reading, as we got it in Untier, an animal, deer. Deer is animal in German. It's not deer, Untier. Now that means an enormous and terrifying animal. Huge and, how do you say, bulky, not elegant, not gracile, but shapeless and overwhelming and a mass of a thing. Maybe I can say something like Cthulhu. You know, that is an Untier, the Lovecraftian Cthulhu. That's an Untier. And then we got Ungetüm, which is very close to that, which doesn't even accept a positive, only a negative. There is no Getüm, but only a Ungetüm. Peculiarly, two prefixes and one suffix, but no center to the word. So can also have some meaning of eerie, spooky, formlessness, overwhelming presence, or shadowiness. So Untiefe can be shallow, the shallows in the waterway, for example, and can be abysmal, enormous depths.
Okay.
I'm sorry if that's not.
No, that's, I mean, yeah, that's, you know, that's more than I can grasp, but I get the point that Untiefe could mean both shallows and deeps.
In philosophical speech, there is a couplet of two words, Urgrund, primordial reason, primordial causation, primordial motive. Grund is difficult to explain, but Ur is something like primordial, pristine, like that. But it is paired in nearly the same meaning with Ungrund, bottomlessness, bottom. And that is the ultimate bottom. Ungrund and Urgrund are often used interchangeably.
Okay.
One is primordial pristine, the other is an unbottom, but the meaning is a bottomless bottom.
Okay. It's amazing that any translation works.
Well, so this term, though, is coming from, in particular, in the Romantic, German Naturphilosophie idealist tradition, from the mystic Jakob Boehme and his concept of the Ungrund. And Heidegger also repeats this, maybe Nietzsche does as well. So it's in the air, but the idea is also translated by Hart on page 90 in chapter 3, an essential infinite super depth, Untiefe. So super depth, and then it appears a couple other places.
That's okay, and that's kind of that's very consistent with what, Andreas was saying.
Yeah, Andreas was pointing to just this exactly, right. In Jakob Boehme, the Ungrund is deployed in this kind of theological categorical way that Conrad-Martius is also using it in this transphysical, as she would say, manner.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for bearing with me on this. I'm trying to find this site, and I'm sure it's in a footnote in chapter 4, and so I was trying to locate.
Well, page 90, page 100, and also page 167.
Right, that's it. Because what I did, I had no idea as I was going through this stuff what word this word that appears. Oh, here it is. Yeah, it is. It's the one on 167.
Yeah, and then on 100, there's this more than space, something more than space. In the Apeiron, space becomes more than space, or a super space, Unraum. And the Un here, Unraum, it means basically the same thing as like the Ungrund and Untiefe. The super depth could be interpreted as space. Here it's this super space as the Apeiron. So the superlative super or Uber, is very frequently found in all of this stuff, because she's talking about the constitution of the center, or the world as like being the center point between these extremes, between the above and the below. There's this above and below potency going into the actualization of what we experience.
Okay, I found that because she threw me for a loop with the phrase archonal being.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what an archon was.
Oh, okay.
So then I had to find out what an archon was. And I don't know how that came out in German, and so I don't know how much of it Jim borrowed, how much he borrowed to use archonal being in English. But then who the archon were kind of gives a mythological flavor to the notion of
Right.
archonal being.
Well, like in Gnosticism, there's the archons.
Right.
But
That's
the archon is just like a ruler, and so like you'll find it in like Plato's Republic, the archon, you know, of Athens.
right.
Some
Well,
guy.
okay, now the question for me is, I mean, if I'm really going to go all in on this, I mean, I'm going to be really serious. I'm going to let myself be vulnerable and naked to my ignorance as I try to understand what's going on. The question is, what is it that everybody else seems to know that I don't? Or is it the case that there isn't any such thing? Or is it that what everybody has in his pocket, in his back pocket, is the link between Aristotle and Aquinas, and that there's a theological subtext that's buried way down in here, which is pretty churchy, pretty Roman, and yet that's never allowed or admitted. We're talking about physics, we're talking about quantum, we're talking about all this stuff. How much of this is finally apologia for the church?
Well, there's Orthodox Church, but you know, theology broadly is what Aristotle considered metaphysics. Like his metaphysics, the books, you know, he considered that theology.
Okay, fair enough. But I want to ask the question that I think so. But what does Athens have to tell Jerusalem?
Once again, please. Acoustically, I didn't get you.
Sorry. What does Athens have to tell Jerusalem? That is, this is highly Christianized, or at least highly Abrahamic in the background. And as we know, of course, Martius was devout. Her connection to, as you mentioned to me earlier, Randy, that her connection to Saint Edith Stein came at a very critical time before she wrote a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today.
Yeah, well, I mean, the spirituality is something that you could take as being Orthodox Christian, whether Catholic or non-Catholic, like Conrad-Martius was more like evangelical, you know, Baptist sort
Fair
of
enough.
thing.
Yeah, I was thinking Aquinas when I said wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, these categories are trans-traditional. They're part of the Philosophia Perennis. You know, so like the Greeks are doing something that the Christianized Latin, beginning with the Roman tradition, is developing in their own way. Andreas?
Yes, I got one or two ideas, if this is the right place. I haven't joined you for some sessions, so if I'm not catching up with the dynamics of the interaction, please forgive me. Is it all right that I introduce some ideas?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that there is a great rift. The archon in Athens for Plato is a good administrator, but the archon for the Gnostic is a Seleucid oppressor and an adversary to the Aramaic people from the Nile River to the Persian Gulf. So there is an opposition, and that opposition is also active between Catholicism and Gnosticism, or between worship for Mary and Luther. And I feel also that conflict between HCM and Husserl. For Husserl, as much as I could grasp until today, introduces himself very much like a pure consciousness thinker. And HCM envisages opening up to the cosmic life and finding structures and analogies to consciousness in the so-called outer world. Now, this is a millennia-old quarrel between individualism and collectivism, between hierarchy and rebellion, between poverty and affluence. Also, you might say so, and that question was very flagrant, I think, particularly before the First World War and between the two wars in the interwar period, because the how would you say, the Pope, active in 1918, is quoted to have said, "It's Luther who has how do you say in English? Who has been defeated in this war, who has lost this war. It's Luther who has lost this war." So there was some discussion, some public discussion also. And Husserl very starkly sided with Lutheranism. There is a beautiful little book about Austrian Jews converting in Vienna to Lutheranism in the Belle Epoque era. But regrettably, it's in German, and not even many university libraries here have it. But didn't I already send it to you? She put it, if you're interested, I can send it to you, but it's in German. And there are many Jewish intellectuals who, well, maybe I'm going too far astray now. I would say there are, I think there are some tendencies maybe which are not reconcilable and cannot be inscribed into one coherent line of narration. At least the individualist consciousness viewpoint and the collectivist or say hierarchical cosmic viewpoint, as much as I see today, cannot easily be reconciled. As can't the Athenian archon with the archon beneath the whip of which the Arameans had to live and to develop Gnosticism.
Yeah, well, let's look exactly at the way this word is used real quick. So I'm just like searching it in the PDF. You know, I've read this book a lot, so I can kind of help navigate us through these findings. So the first instance of the prefix archon in the there's a reference to the archonal, the hypokaimenal and archonal regions. So that's one kind of distinction to bear in mind. Later, there's this use of archonal as being opposed to hyletic. Of course, hypokaimenal and hyletic are synonymous in certain functional respects. And then there's a sense in which the not just this negative making a distinction between the hyletic, hypokaimenal, and archonal, but the archonal is also tied to the I-ness or the itselfness. And it's also tied to the notion of pneumatic substance. So with these references alone, and there's like a handful, there's like, I think, looks like 11 or so references in the book to show us how it's deployed. And some of these refer to like other discussions saying like the whole discussion of pneumatic substance helps explain this archonal notion. You get a good sense of what it means. So what it means is that on the one side, in this analysis into two terms with the hypokaimenal or the material, you know, stuff on the side of the prote hule, and on the other side, the these other categories like Geist, the Ursukische, etc. You know, these are all pneumatic or so they meet in the middle, right? But then there's this relationship where the I-ness or the hypokaimenal, depending on how you look at it, is the one like outside of the other, or the one that the other one stands on, or something like that, you know? So substantiality, substance, not just being, which is a broader category, but substantiality is that being which it's able to grasp itself and have some kind to like maybe objectify itself to stand on itself. So that's the beginning of this archon. It means, you know, to initiate, but it's also in the sense of like, I think being like dropping anchor, you know, having some ground to stand on in this vast Untiefe. Yeah.
Arcane, the verb, means to make a beginning, to make a start. And on is the participle active, no? Archon.
Right.
So it is he who makes a start, he who begins from the scratch, he who is the source of legislation or ordering or something like that. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that is perfectly applicable.
And another question, hypokemi, how is it? I picked it up in Greek grammar. It is the equivalent to a Latin grammar term, isn't it? Hypokemi, is that subject or theme, or what is it in Latin grammar theory?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, it's a term in ancient philosophy. It just means like substantiality, or maybe like in a broader sense to encompass.
Did I mistake that substance? Did I mistake substance for a translation of hypostasis?
What, in Conrad-Martius?
No, I mean generally. I'm sorry.
I mean, you could do that. You could go that way, right? I mean,
okay. There is no fixed coupling between hypokemi and a certain Latin terminology.
I mean, I'm not an etymologist or a philologist. I'm not sure. All I know is the way Conrad-Martius is using it is bringing in an understanding of ancient philosophy that's really good. You know, she's doing Aristotelian metaphysics, which is, it's done. You know, it's not unheard of, right? But she's doing it in a way that the arche apeiron of Anaximander is maintained. So the connections between the Platonic Aristotelian type of ancient philosophy is maintaining its connection to and building on the tradition of the pre-Socratics. So like the category of apeiron is so important for Conrad-Martius. It's all pervasive. But the relationship between the apeiron and paros, which we find in the word, you know, in English, the Pyrrhic space-time, Pyrrhetia Raumzeit, in Der Raum and Die Zeit, her late works, you know, we find that there. But the apeiron has this relationship to everything in our analyses. So in Conrad-Martius, there's the apeiron. It can be an apeirotic space-time. It has to be an apeirotic space-time for the things that exist inside of space-time. But really, the apeiron is this arche, or this general principle that is also giving us the place for this prote-hule that all of the forms draw on. And formation begins with this archonal I-ness or itselfness of substantiality. And from that, just self-standing principle of the arche I, or the self, you know, maybe in the first case, this primordial spirit, the Urgeistiges, like as we see on this diagram, you know, that's the real beginning of substantiality, of substantial being. Because really it has its beginning, but it's beyond that in the apeiron. So it's kind of like, you could think of like a triangle graph where the foundation is this ontological dynamism that can be interpreted as the I, or the self, starts like making these little whirls of types of being. And then you have crystals, and then plants, and then animals, and then humans, and then like pure spirits or angels. You know, so real quick, just like imagine this diagram starting from a center point, but also you can like see how that center point is the siphoning in of that which is all pervasive, from the periphery all throughout of the apeiron. So it's like that which is being pulled by the principle of the I, and developing all these organic forms of substantiality, or forms of life and life world. So, I mean, the word arcanal, I think, is something that we can take out of Conrad-Martius's context and apply, you know, the Gnostic and the other types of religious interpretations, whether they're like Christian or not. You know, they might be more like the ancient pagan interpretations. You know, from the Christian perspective, it's pagan, but it's just traditional theology back in the day, right? Because there is this theological aspect in Aristotle where everything's coming from the unmoved mover, but it has to go through this chain. In the metaphysics, he refers to a chain that's not different from the chain we see in Hesiod and in Plato, in the Ion, and in the myth of air at the end of the Republic. There's this chain of adamantine that connects all the spheres. In the metaphysics, Aristotle refers to an iron chain. So to explain causality coming from the unmoved mover as this magnet of all magnets, you know, this ultimate magnet that carries the force through. Yeah.
Now that's exactly cosmicism. Or the pure consciousness viewpoint would say spontaneity is at the core of spiritual existence and not causality. Causality maybe does not stem from the metaphysical foundation of things, but maybe is in a more conservative sense hyletic. Now, not hyletic as you did use it in the last weeks or last month, but hyletic in that Gnostic sense. There is a Hele, which maybe has been there from beginningless time. And now it is very conspicuous that here there is the endeavor to make Hele like a fountainhead of creation or Promethean self-realization or something like that. That is,
I mean, these terms can be interpreted in all of these, from all these different, I don't know, you can call them like lenses, right? But I think it's important to keep a few constellations of types of philosophy or contexts in mind. And one of them is the ancient Aristotelian concept, which is very robust, including the pre-Socratics, you know, but also this Kantian context, where the Kantian category of the outer intuition of space is deriving from or being superimposed upon this manifold of infinite space, or this infinite region of space. And then within that, the distinctions of the specific dimensionality of space later get imposed.
Mm-hmm.
So in the section on the real ontology of space, Conrad-Martius calls this infinite totality the apeiron, following the work of Hans Voss, who's doing this really in-depth analysis of Kant. And maybe, I think really hers is really in-depth as well in Der Raum. So Der Raum has this kind of Aristotelian Kantian interpretation to understand this transcendental infinite space, this given with background of the world, this always already given.
Can I ask, I thought I was going with you when you said, oh, you gave me a very helpful description of an Aristotelian point of view. Then you said, but there's also a Kantian point of view. And now, just now, you hyphenated them.
Yeah.
And said Aristotelian, Kantian, having urged us at the beginning to keep them apart. And now you want to bridge them with a hyphen. So,
I never said to keep them apart.
Okay.
You know, I know that there's this urge in the traditions, you know, like your usual Kantian academic will maybe have like some kind of sore spot for metaphysics, especially Aristotle, you know, or the typical Aristotelian will often, or maybe 60% of the time, be against the theologizing you know, because they think that Aristotle's their representative of what they take to be their, like, you know, untheological, atheistic, natural worldview, right? Aristotle's the archon of science, and he's the king of the natural attitude. I find this at least in the American Academy, there's a lot of like interpretation that tries to make it untheological, and like obviously for the purpose of like demythologizing all the really funny forms of theology that we have, especially here in the United States with our Baptists, with their billboards that say really, really absurd things. That is what people think, you know, and that's very different from the kind of spirituality that's also still very different from like New Age spirituality. But the kind of spirituality that you get in Conrad-Martius is real, you know, and it's robust and it's connected to science and metaphysics. So, I mean, for her, it's not so crazy to hyphenate Aristotle, Kant. You know, I mean, what Kant is doing is I'm not so much of an expert, you know, but it sounds to me like he's trying to put the tradition of metaphysics through this baptism of fire of critique, you know, and that pure reason has to have the final word on what is going on metaphysically, you know. So it's not that it's not the destruction of metaphysics in the sense of, and then no more metaphysics, you know, it's about clarifying metaphysics. And Conrad-Martius builds on that. So she's already there. She already understands the value of Kant and Kantian philosophy, and her and the whole Kritischer Realismus tradition, which includes the other great philosopher of nature, what's his name? Anyway, it includes a number of interesting figures. Yeah, so she puts them together, and section 3.8, the real ontology of space, from chapter 3, especially pages 94, 95, introduce this concept of the apeirotic space-time as the apeiron of Kant. Not that he uses that term, you know, in the critique of pure reason, but he does talk about this manifold, that the things that fill the categories of intuition of space and time are placed inside of. So he uses, I know he uses the term mannigfaltigkeit there, and he must say like unendliche Mannigfaltigkeit or something like that. But yeah, anyway, that section develops the Kantian transcendental intuition of space in terms of her spatial apeiron. So that's like really the beginning of this section that we find in chapter 4 on the apeirotic space-time, because she really develops it. It has its genesis in her interpretation of quantum theory, but it has its background in her overall philosophy, her overall Seinslehre and Usiology, her theory of substance. And really, like, all of these categories go together. You know, for her, biology and physics are not so separate the way we conceive of them today. And that constellation is not different from metaphysics in the theological sense too, you know, in the sense of like everything deriving from this unmoved mover, you know. And of course that kind of concept needs to be demythologized. It's not that there's like this Jehovah in the sky who's the unmoved mover, you know. I mean, there might, that kind of sentence carries some meaning. And of course, when we interpret the meaning, we have to understand that it doesn't mean that there's something with properties like eyes and a face. But it could, you know, if you're really Levinasian or Gnostic or something, you know, you might want to do that. And maybe she's doing that also, maybe because she is, you know, an evangelical of sorts. She's part of this Schobdacher Kreis, this very specific Bavarian religion, you know, basically evangelical circle.
How are they called? What is their name?
The Schop. Sometimes it's SCHOP, sometimes it's SCHOB.
Uh-huh.
When it's written
Schop.
here, Joaquin Feldez writes about it in his book.
Please turn it. It's upside down.
Oh, oops. Das Phenomenology.
Okay.
About her Berg-Zabern circle.
Yeah. Thank you.
He talks about it in there, and in Kosmos und Polis, the Gottstein Sepp one. This one. There's a chapter or two on that topic.
Yeah.
It's interesting to consider her specific theological context. I think the way Jim puts it in the book, and the way it's understood generally, is that she had to. It sounds like an apology, like she had to publish in the Hochland magazine. But I started ordering some of these these things where she was publishing in, and they're really, it's a different world then. It's not like some Catholic magazine that you would pick up today. It's deeply philosophical and scientific, very in touch with the humanities and the sciences. Yeah, do you want to say something?
Yes, if I may, I would just contribute 3 more glosses. First, I think in the interwar period, nearly every intellectual was quite familiar with Fichte's 14 speeches to the German nation. For this was an anti-Napoleonic series of pamphlets, or more exactly speeches, which were really delivered in person by Fichte in Berlin, at that time besieged by the French. And one of these speeches got lost also by incursion of the French police in Berlin at that time. And in the 7th of these 14 speeches, or maybe 13 today, to the end, there is 2 or 3 pages long expounding of Fichte's fundamental goal in philosophy. And there he underlines very, let's say repeatedly, the notion of more than infinity, über Unendlichkeit. That's very important for his view on consciousness data, and therefore for he posits the subject viewpoint for primal ontology at all. So if she makes a big thing out of to apeiron, then I think it will have rung for the learned audience that she says cosmos is, let me be very vernacular, cosmos is enough. Cosmos is the biggest thing there is. And that is configurationally a counterpart to the Ecclesia Eterna. There is no more than infinity. I very much, how do you say, empfehlen, I encourage you, let's say, I encourage you to open the 14 speeches unto the German nation, speech number 7, the last 2 or 3 pages. Give a very good idea, and I'm sure that everybody knew it at that age. That's the first thing. The second thing is, toteon, hoteos, is not cognate with Deus. It has nothing to do with the Latin word God, which is also the rich one, like in Slavonic book, has nothing to do, but comes from a word for perfume, for church perfume. How do you say in English? It's incense. Incense. Yeah. Now, one very beautiful piece of nearly methodologically exact metaphysics is the late antique Procrus's Theologicae Stoicheosis, the ABC of theology, let's say, or a knowledge of seriousness in theology. And there, by the word theology, he intends to say metaphysics. And the third thing is, you showed us that beautiful idea of something like a cone or a triangle stemming from one starting point. There is, and I gave you a Wikipedia article also, for I don't know the English literature on that material. There are beautiful film captions also with Heisenberg concerning that matter. The same Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker was developing when he passed away in the late 1980s, I think. He had been developing for more than 2 or 3 decades a wholly genuine idea of interpretation for quantum theory, which was called Quantentheorie der Uralternativen, quantum theory of, let's say, primordial or first alternatives. And with him, there can be deduced a mathematical structure, the name of which I can't even recall in the terminology, but there is a mathematical structure which can be correlated doubly. It works 2 ways around. From space to that mathematical structure, and from that mathematical structure to space. And it needs no space to begin with, but only an ever-increasing multitude of alternatives, that's to say A-B choices, sprouting one from the preceding one and becoming ever more numerous. That research was interrupted by his death, and I think nobody has continued on that. But there are 2 or 3 beautiful contributions in the German internet, and if you're interested, I can send it to you another time. Also, it would take me some time to find it again, but that fits quite beautifully with your triangular figure. That's only some glosses.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. And in fact, I mean, this the space-time within which these bifurcations, making more and more fractal triangles happens, while there is a hierarchical order where like maybe a first choice is made and then each one has another set of choices and it quickly becomes very hairy, very numerous, and very complex. They're not necessarily happening according to like what we would call like real space-time, or what Conrad-Martius is calling the Pyrrhic space-time of our measurements, right? It's happening according to a different kind of time in particular. So this is a lot like the aeonic space-time category that we'll find especially in chapter 5. But these kinds of things were not unprecedented. I mean, they're new with Heisenberg for the quantum theory interpretation, and in other places, maybe in Everett's possible worlds theory, if there's like a temporal side of it, I'm not sure. But this is part of like the order of the angels in Proclus and in Dionysus the Areopagite, and in other Neoplatonic and Renaissance traditions, where these orders of creation that support the hierarchical ordered structures of the finished cosmos are happening in an aeonic space-time. So, I mean, the triangle diagram, and you see it especially in like Nicholas of Cusa, where there's like this double pyramid structure called the figura pyramidalis or figura paradigmatica, right? It gives you this kind of version of that, really, where each of the sections of each of these triangles on either side give you the different orders or powers of 10, so that there's like the Pythagorean 10 over here, and then it goes to like 100, and then 1,000, and then 10,000. And in a lot of these systems, and like in the Greek, for instance, the 10,000 is a stand-in for many things. because the word for 10,000 is myriad, and it has like an accent, and then without the accent, it actually literally means 10,000. And of course, it's the word myriad or many. So, I mean, there's a few traditions where it's 10,000 is the number. René Guénon speculates it's because it's the fourth power of 10. You know, and then this is part of the Tetractian Pythagorean tradition. But anyway, I digress. But this kind of triangular structure is common to these, but it's also itself paradigmatic in other places, and in particular, and this is what I'm really interested in, is the semeion of Archytas, pseudo Archytas. So
Archytas.
Here, let me show you
The Ouroboros.
So, I mean, for me, the Ouroboros structure is part of these circle diagrams. Like, this is from Der Raum. So this gives you the Aonische Raumzeit Einheit that our 3 + 1 dimensional Minkowski-Einstein spacetime continuum manifold is moving along this fourth spatial dimension. So this is one example of a circle diagram. But you know, some of these things, there are many different circle diagrams, but part of the ancient Spirake or astrologia of the Greeks was that it was equally astronomical science and transcendental optics. And in fact, when Lambert used the term phenomenology early on, before Kant, he meant both transcendental optics and astronomy in his organon. So even the word phenomenology, which derives from that, I forget the Greek phrase, sotsien des phenomene or whatever, you know, saving the phenomena was the original motive of phenomenology. The way it saved it was by reducing the phenomena to the essence through epoche, and that essence was this astral form, or you know, the cosmic being, which was ultimately this rational cosmos noetos, you know, noeton. And that rational form comes down to an ultimate logos of reason, or the nous poeticos, maybe. I'm just speculating here. But whatever that noetic paradigm, like in Timaeus, the paradigm for all the noetic beings that derive from it, like all the little fractal bifurcations, the Ur-Alternativen, the paradigmatic form is the sphere and the relation of the center to the periphery. So in another work, in the Syntax of Time, there's this discussion of, in the phenomenology of space-time, in the context of Husserl's phenomenology of time, there's this question of the figure of indication, the semeion in pseudo-Archytas of Iamblichus. So Iamblichus talks about pseudo-Archytas, and Archytas is this Pythagorean friend of Plato. We actually have letters between them, but there's this thing called the semeion, and here's some ways of diagramming it, because we don't have surviving diagrams. It could just be like a point that a single ray makes upon reflection. It could be a kind of conveyor belt smooth situation. And finally, this is Peter Manchester's proposal, is that there's actually two rays, two separate rays, each in their own dimension. And this is my interpretation of what Conrad-Martius means by this founding ontological dynamism. You can think of it like not coming from a one-dimensional ray, but from a zero-dimensional apeiron, which is ever present, right? It's all over, coming through this point, which is also dimensionless in the first case, the monad, and then coming out as a single-dimensional ray in all directions. So in like the Zohar and the you know, what is it? The SoPheRE, you know, tradition, there's this pre-given situation, sometimes interpreted as chaos, this is not so far from the biblical, the deeps and the Sumerian Tiamat. And then this principle, the archon, like maybe Marduk, or what becomes Adam in the book of Genesis, or some kind of principle, maybe personified or maybe not. Maybe it's just like the idea of a point, or like the Big Bang, happens, and then there's this explosion, radiation in all directions to form this infinite sphere of light, as it is in the Tzimtzum doctrine of Luria, in the Luriaic.
I'm absolutely with you. I'm absolutely with you. But
so there's a number of traditions where this same structure is used, and in particular, the SoPheRE is what is the standard already in the air when Eudoxus and Aristarchus and Apollonius and all of these people who have texts on astronomy and on astrologia or SoPheRE are writing about. There's this structure already. It's understood that things derive from these spheres, and then there's like lost textbooks where we don't have the ultimate source for all of this, but they say it's coming from Egypt at times, like Plato says this. But the pseudo-hermetic tradition of the infinite sphere, for me, this is just my interpretation now, fits perfectly well all of this doctrine of the spheres, or the SoPheRE. So anyway, I think that's my interpretation, and going along with the idea of the infinite sphere is this idea of the infinitesimal one, or the center, and then how does that relate to the things that derive from this one or center? And it would have to go through this kind of structure that Peter Manchester is talking about in his work. And in Conrad-Martius here, this is the founding ontological dynamism, or the ontological dynamic, or the fundamental dynamism. Sometimes Jim will use this phrase. I'm not sure what the German is that Conrad-Martius is using in all these instances, but this is kind of the view of the analogia entis, where there's this actus purus, and everything that there is, like the Poland Spring water bottle, is on its way to that actus purus in like one dimension, and then in another dimension, it's on its way out to the periphery, to the apeiron. So there's this clashing where...
That I didn't get. That very last idea, I didn't get it. Could you put it in other words?
So here's some thing, right? This thing in the finished cosmos, this finished artwork thing,
okay.
Right?
Okay.
And if you think of it as like having, being an actualization, an intellectual and mass hyletic actualization of this real substance in space-time, it's coming both down from above and up from below. So it has this hyletic, self-standing inner gravity. If I let go, it falls down. But it also has this radiation, interpreted in many different ways, on different registers and on different scales. So there's like literally like a radioactive decay that's part of its like electrical form holding structures, all these different ways, like the appearance of it as a phenomenal appearance. It's partaking both of this radiation from you could think of it like the Big Bang, the cosmological singularity, not far away and not affecting us, like the deistic usual idea of the Big Bang is just some wacky thing that happened, 13 billion years ago, and it's no longer affecting us.
God is away since the moment of creation, as with Calvin.
Right. So this kind of worldview that is, in a sense, theological, the creation is a lot like the idea of the Big Bang. The Big Bang and the Bohr atom, these are all just models. They're heuristic devices that we use to conceptualize the things that evidence is presenting to us with our more and more sophisticated forms of instrumentality. So the extensions of the soul in its grasp of phenomena and of the world and of the relations between, other individuals and other possible worlds is giving us, certain information that we develop based on whatever our attitude and paradigmatic constellation might be. So with phenomenology, we want to combat the natural attitude, which is really the affliction of modernity, to be stuck in this mental rational structure since Descartes' analytic geometry and the passions of the soul, where he distinguishes mind and body in such a way that has stuck or has become emblematic for the kind of modern problematic that Husserl diagnoses, or equally the kind of situation that Heidegger complains about and that he calls enframing, and what the kind of essence of technique that he calls cybernetics, this world dominating spirit of techne that wants to take over the world, totalize and optimize emptily, that Husserl says is an emptying of meaning. In The Crisis, he says that this arithmetization of geometry, or this reduction of natural, intuitive, geometrical experience of space-time and objects in space-time, real experience, is being reduced to algebraic formulae. And this formular Philosophie, to use the Fichtean distinction between reale Philosophie and formular Philosophie, that is being continued in Kritischer Realismus, is an emptying of meaning. And this is the essence of the spiritual crisis. And at the center of it, for Husserl in The Crisis, is the enigma of subjectivity, the paradoxes of subjectivity. And so many philosophers have picked up on this. There's Merleau-Ponty talks about a kind of embracing of the fecund contradiction with the paradoxes of subjectivity, the paradoxes of space, the paradoxes of time. And in Conrad-Martius, these paradoxes are dealt with in a very specific way. She has her sections where she analyzes the antinomies of Aristotle and of Kant, and her solution is not so different from the traditional metaphysics, but it's also something that is a proposal for contemporary scientific disciplines like physics and biology and multiple, because really it's ultimately a doctrine of Wissenschaftslehre. So she's actually having this big meta-scientific perspective that has some resonance with like the Drishian, intellectual type of biology on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can actually see when we look at these sections on space and time, how it connects to quantum and relativity theories of her day. And then I know that there are people today who are interested in Conrad-Martius because of their interpretation of this stuff as quantum wave gravity and quantum loop gravity.
Okay. It's almost 10 after 3.
Yeah.
I'm number one. If you permit me, number one, thank you very much for all of this. I don't think that anyone should feel that we deviated from what matters. And I think Jim, among all of us, does not appreciate pedantic readings of his text. It's not that kind of book. Number one, it's a PhD dissertation. So I think, but it's incredibly rich. And I think a lot of what I heard and tried to contribute today was kind of responding to the richness that the text provides, but it's not close to the text. It's almost because you say, what the hell is he talking about? Or what was she talking about? And you struggle and you say, well, what about this? And that can be very helpful depending on what you bring to it. And so when you talked about saving the appearances, you said saving the phenomena, but saving the appearances, that's right exactly what I'm working and trying to write about now, because so much, and you can teach from that perspective. You can teach good students with the idea of saving the appearances. It's a phrase that doesn't immediately suggest what it's about. But as you begin to unpack it, you say, oh my goodness, this is really interesting. Plato's instructions to the astronomers develop some way of accounting for the motions of these heavenly bodies. And I don't really care if it doesn't last or if it doesn't conform to whatever the ultimate reality is. Now that sounds pretty pragmatic to me. And, and so already you're off to the races with, well, what do you mean by the pragmatic theory of truth anyway? And so it just opens up so much. And I, for one, appreciate it and hope that we can continue in this spirit because to me, it's doing philosophy in some way without being slavish about it.
Yeah, well, remember, it begins in wonder, right? Philosophy is the love of wisdom, and in so many different senses, it begins in wonder. And the wondrous is certainly what this Dunklen dimension, of this background potens, or whatever you want to call all these other dimensions, or even lower dimensions,
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm aimed at my particular group of very smart undergraduates. They are my audience and my mission. And I think the idea of, never mind whether trying to prove God's existence, that's largely a fool's errand. But God's possibility isn't. And so moving from possibility, you say, well, what's the relationship between what's possible? And you would think that very smart Ivy League undergraduates would have thought about this. And they say, I never thought about that. Like, what do you mean? You never thought? No. Well, to tell you the truth, I hadn't either. And so, and of course, Conrad-Martius is all over possibility. I mean, it's, she really opens a lot of doors about possibility. And that's, and so then you can say, well, we need to do modal logic. Yep, probably should do some modal logic somewhere along the line to tighten the screws on this vehicle that we're riding in. Anyway, I could go on, but I leave it to the younger people to do this. And I just want to thank you all. It was really terrific today. So we shouldn't feel bad about it.
Yeah, well, this is a good place to wrap up. I agree. I appreciate you saying that, Gordon, because we didn't stick close to the text, but I think that some of these issues are best dealt with by, the hermeneutics of distantiation, as Ricoeur calls it.
Yeah.
We need to take the longue durée.
Yeah. And I can't imagine that Jim feels otherwise.
I mean, he's just being humble. It's really, a really terrific text. It's doing a really difficult thing, which is to capture Conrad-Martius's overall philosophy, which is very foreign, very alien to the usual, but it also synthesizes philosophy in a way that is very unique and very important.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you to you all. Look forward to the next meeting.
Will it be in a fortnight or next week?
Oh, not next week. Yeah. Let's see here. The fortnight is on the 6th of August. So why don't we kind of poll around whether I think the 6th would be best.
Mm-hmm. For me also.
Actually, the 13th would be better for me. So something to consider. If we do the 13th, we could still also do the 27th before the semester starts for some. I know that's actually the beginning of the semester for some. So we'll look in an email.
Okay, good. That'd be great. Thank you.
All right, so with that, I'll release everyone, and I'll see you on the email. See you in the future.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.